At my daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner, my ex-husband stood up and said, "Before we celebrate, there's something the groom should hear." The room had that specific quality that rooms have when they are full of people who love each other and are about to become family. Warm and slightly too loud, the kind of noise that builds itself from genuine affection rather than obligation. 42 people around tables in the private room of a restaurant my daughter Zora had chosen because it had the exact exposed brick and candlelight aesthetic that she had been curating in her imagination since she was 23 and had seen it in a photograph. She was 29 now, and the man she was marrying was named Desmond Achebe, and he was watching her from across the room with the expression of someone who cannot believe their luck, one which was the correct expression for a man who was about to marry my daughter. I had been watching that expression all evening from my seat between my sister Vivienne and my current husband Graham, and I'd been feeling the specific warmth of a parent watching a child arrive somewhere good. And then my ex-husband Raymond Cordy pushed back his chair and stood up, and the warmth in my chest became something else entirely in approximately 2 seconds. Raymond and I had been divorced for 17 years. Zora had been 12 when we separated, and 16 when the divorce was final, old enough to have formed her own clear understanding of what had happened in our marriage and why it had ended, which was why I found it somewhat remarkable that she had invited him to the rehearsal dinner at all. I'd asked her about it once, on about 8 months before the wedding when the guest list was being assembled, and she had said, "He's my father." She had said it in the tone that meant the conversation was complete, which was one of the ways Zora was like me and also one of the ways she was wiser. Raymond had been, in the specific taxonomy of failed marriages, not a bad man, but an undependable one. The kind of man who was warm and present when it suited him, and absent when it didn't, who had missed school events for reasons that were always just plausible enough to accept, and had borrowed money from me 3 times in the years after the divorce with the particular ease of someone who did not experience asking as a cost. I had managed my feelings about Raymond into a functional neutral over the preceding decade. Mace, the specific achievement of a woman who had decided her daughter's relationship with her father was not her territory to manage. I was proud of this achievement. I was watching it evaporate in real time as Raymond stood with his wine glass in his hand and smiled the smile I recognized from 22 years of marriage as the smile he wore when he had decided he was the most important person in the room. He said, "Before we celebrate, there's something the groom should hear." He said it in a carrying voice, the voice of a man who had been waiting to say something and had picked the moment. The room went the specific quiet of 42 people registering simultaneously that something was happening that was not on the evening's agenda. Need I saw Zora's face from across the room. She was sitting next to Desmond, and she had turned toward her father with an expression I recognized as the held breath of a child who has learned to expect the unexpected from a parent and has never fully stopped bracing. I felt Graham's hand on my arm. I felt my own chest go completely still, in the way it went still when I was managing something. Raymond looked at Desmond and he said, "I want you to know what you're getting into." He said, "I want you to know about the financial situation." He said, "Because a man deserves to know what he's marrying into." And then, in front of 42 people who had come to celebrate the beginning of my daughter's marriage, my ex-husband spent the next 4 minutes describing, in the specific selective accuracy of someone weaponizing partial truths, a version of my financial history that included a business failure from 11 years ago, a period of debt that had been real and had been resolved, and a characterization of my spending habits that bore no resemblance to the person I had been for the preceding decade. He was smiling while he said it. He finished and sat down and picked up his fork like he had just made a toast. I had been a financial advisor for 16 years when Raymond stood up at that dinner, running my own independent practice that I had built from nothing after the business failure he had just described to 42 people. And I had been managing my clients' money and my own with the specific care of someone who had gone through a difficult period and understood exactly what it had cost and what it had taught. The business failure had been real, a retail venture I had gone into with a partner who turned out to be less reliable than her business plan, an investment I'd lost $85,000 on in a period where $85,000 was everything I had and more. I had taken on personal debt to cover my obligations, had spent 4 years paying it down, had emerged from the experience with a clearer understanding of risk than any business school could have provided. My practice now managed approximately $12 million in client assets. My personal finances were in the kind of order that allowed me to split the cost of my daughter's wedding with Graham without noticing it. Raymond had described a bankruptcy that had not happened, a debt level that was not current. And a pattern of financial behavior that belonged to a version of me that was 11 years and an entirely rebuilt life removed from who I actually was. He had done this in 4 minutes, in public, in front of my daughter's wedding party. I did not speak at the dinner after Raymond sat down. This was not composure exactly. It was the decision made in the first 5 seconds that if I responded publicly, I would be doing it in front of 42 people, including Zora, including Desmond's family, and that the only way to make this worse was to turn it into a public confrontation. I sat with my hands flat in my lap where Graham could not see them, and I looked at my daughter, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who was doing the same thing I was doing, holding something down because the alternative was worse. And Desmond had the expression of a man who had received information he wasn't sure how to process, which was understandable, and also the thing that was going to have to be addressed as soon as the dinner was over, because Zora was getting married in 18 hours. Graham leaned toward me and said quietly, "Do you want to leave?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you want me to say something?" I said, "No." He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to fix this tonight, and tomorrow I want our daughter to get married." He nodded. He understood, which was one of the reasons I had married him. After the dinner, when the tables were clearing and the older guests were collecting coats, and Desmond's mother was holding Zora's hand and saying something that made Zora smile despite the evening, I found Raymond by the coat check. I did not raise my voice. And I said, "I need to speak to you." He looked at me with the expression he always wore when he believed he had done something correct and was waiting to be thanked for the courage of doing it. He said, "I think Desmond had a right to know." I said, "What you described at that dinner was not accurate." He said, "It was accurate enough." I said, "It was not." I said, "You described a bankruptcy that didn't happen. You described a debt level that hasn't existed for 8 years. You described a pattern of behavior that isn't mine." He said, I was giving him context. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I need you to understand that I will be addressing this tonight." He said, "With who?" I said, "With Desmond." I said, "And whatever you said to that room, I will be providing documentation to contradict it by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." And he said, "You're overreacting." I said, "Good night, Raymond." I collected Graham from where he was waiting near the door, and we found Zora and Desmond, and we went somewhere private to talk. The private room was a sitting area near the restaurant's entrance that the manager, a woman named Claudette, who had noticed what was happening and was either the most perceptive restaurant manager I had ever encountered or had seen scenes like this before, had made available to us without being asked. We sat, me, Graham, Zora, Desmond, and for the first minute, nobody said anything. Desmond spoke first. He was 28 years old, a structural engineer, with the precision of someone who was accustomed to working with accurate specifications and understood the problems that arose from inaccurate ones. He said, "I want to understand what was actually true in what Mr. Cordy said." He said it carefully, without accusation, in the tone of a man trying to get accurate information in a situation where accuracy mattered. I respected this. I said, "The business failure was real. The debt was real. The bankruptcy he described did not happen. The debt was resolved 8 years ago. The characterization of my current financial situation is false. He asked how I could demonstrate this. I said, "I'll have documentation to you by 10 a.m. I said, "Credit reports, current account statements, professional certifications, business accounts." He said, "That's thorough." He said it in a way that suggested he appreciated thoroughness rather than treating it as suspicious. I said, "I have spent 11 years rebuilding something that collapsed. How can I have documentation of every step of the rebuilding?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." He said, "Thank you for being direct." He held Zora's hand, and I watched her breathe for the first time since Raymond had stood up. Graham and I drove home at midnight, and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and built the documentation package I had promised. It took 2 hours. It included my current credit report from all 3 bureaus, pulled directly that evening showing a score of 781 and 0 outstanding delinquencies. It included the closing statements from the period of debt resolution showing the final payments made 8 years ago. It included my current business accounts showing the practice's assets under management and my personal financial statements. It included a professional certification renewal from the financial regulatory body dated 6 months prior, which required clean financial standing as a condition of renewal. It included my personal tax returns for the preceding 3 years, which I had never imagined sharing with anyone outside an accountant's office, but which in this context were the most direct possible evidence of what my financial life actually looked like. I organized everything into a PDF, named it Qley, and drafted a cover note that was 2 paragraphs. One factual summary of what each document demonstrated, one brief statement of context for the business failure and its resolution. It was professional and complete, and completely the opposite of what Raymond had wanted to happen tonight. I sent it to Desmond's email at 2:15 a.m., with an apology for the timing and a note saying I hoped it was useful. The following morning, I did something I'd been considering since the drive home and had decided was necessary. I called an attorney named Priscilla Tamba, a defamation specialist I knew professionally through a client referral network, who had 21 years of practice and the particular combination of precision and strategic calm that defamation work required. She answered at 8:30 a.m. because I had texted at 7 explaining the situation, and she had said she would be available. I described exactly what Raymond had said, to the best of my recollection, and described the context: my daughter's rehearsal dinner, 42 witnesses, a false account of a bankruptcy that did not occur, and financial patterns that did not accurately represent my history. She asked several questions. She asked if I had recorded the dinner. I had not. She asked if there were witnesses who could attest to the specific language used. I said 42 of them. She asked if any of those witnesses had a professional relationship with me or my business that could demonstrate reputational harm. I thought about it. 2 of the attendees were existing clients of my financial advisory practice. She said, "That's potentially significant." She said, "False statements of fact, made publicly, which cause demonstrable harm to a person's professional reputation, meet the elements of defamation." She said, "The question is what you want to do about it." I said, "I want documentation of my options. I want him to understand there are consequences to what he did." She said, "I can prepare a demand letter." She said, "It won't undo last night, but it will make clear that this isn't a cost-free act." I said, "Please." Desmond called me at 9:45 a.m. He said, "I've read everything you sent." He said, "This is very clear." He said, "I want you to know that what happened last night doesn't change anything about tomorrow." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I also want you to know that I called my father this morning and told him what happened." He said, "My father wants to know if you've had a chance to speak to an attorney." I said, "I spoke to one this morning." He said, "Good." He said, "My father is a solicitor." He said that what Mr. Qley did last night was potentially actionable. He said, "He's offered to speak with you after the wedding, if that would be useful." I said, "That's very kind of him." I said, "But right now, I want your wedding to be your wedding." And he said, "Yes." He said it in the tone of a man who was going to marry my daughter in 8 hours and was more than ready to put the previous evening behind him. I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a moment and thought about what Zora had said about Raymond. He's my father. And about the 11 years between the business failure and now, and about the specific unkindness of a man who had chosen the night before his daughter's wedding to describe her mother as financially unreliable to her future husband, and about the fact that despite all of it, in 8 hours, Zora was getting married. Zora came to my house at 11 o'clock. She came alone, without Desmond, because this was the kind of visit that required just the 2 of us. She sat at my kitchen table in the dress she would wear to the ceremony. Not the wedding dress, which was at her flat, but the dress she had chosen for the day of preparation, pale yellow and soft. She said, "I'm sorry about last night." I said, "You don't need to apologize for your father." She said, "I know." She said, "I want to say it anyway." I said, "How are you?" She said, "I'm fine." She said it the way she had said it since she was small, the way that Zora said she was fine, which was always truthful. She was resilient in a way that I had watched her build and that I was proud of, and she was also not someone who performed fine when she wasn't. She said, "Desmond looked at the documents you sent, and he wasn't surprised by what they showed. He said it sounded like something I might do." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "He said you were thorough. He said it like a compliment." She smiled. And I said, "I want to be honest with you about something." She looked at me. I said, "Your father did something damaging last night, and I'm not going to pretend he didn't, and I'm not going to spend today pretending it was fine." She said, "I know." She said, "But it's also today." I said, "I know." She said, "Can we make today about today?" I said, "Yes." And that is what we did. The wedding was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at a garden venue that had been booked for 18 months and that had the specific light of late October that makes people look like they are standing inside a painting. 48 guests, all the rehearsal dinner guests plus a few additions, arranged in chairs among low trees with string lights that would come into their own after dark. Zora walked with me on one side and Graham on the other, which she had decided herself several months ago, and Raymond sat in the family section with the expression of a man who had expected a different outcome from the previous evening and had not received it. Desmond stood at the end of the aisle with the expression of someone who had been told exactly who he was marrying and was very glad of it. The ceremony was 20 minutes and contained everything that mattered. I cried during the vows, which I had not expected to do so fully and which I did not attempt to manage. Graham held my hand. At the reception, Raymond did not make a speech. He had not been scheduled to make a speech. Graham was making one, and Desmond's father, and Zora's close friend, Adaora. But the absence of one from Raymond had a different quality after the previous evening. Might the specific silence of something that had been considered and not attempted. I noticed it. I did not comment on it. The speeches were warm and specific and funny in the right places, and moved the room in the right places. Graham's was about watching Zora become herself, which was the truest thing anyone could have said. I sat through it with my hands folded and thought about 11 years of building and rebuilding and the documentation I had sent at 2:15 a.m. and the demand letter Priscilla Tamba was preparing for Raymond, and about Desmond looking at my financial records and saying it sounded like something Zora's mother would do, and about Zora at my kitchen table in her pale yellow dress saying, "Can we make today about today?" which was the wisest thing anyone had said to me in years. Priscilla sent the demand letter to Raymond the following week. It was formal and specific and named every element of what he had said, citing the witnesses and the context and the demonstrable harm to professional reputation. It demanded a written retraction and apology to be sent to every person present at the rehearsal dinner within 14 days. It noted that failure to comply would result in a formal defamation claim being filed. Raymond's response came through his own solicitor 10 days later. The apology was adequate in the way that forced apologies are adequate. Accurate in the acknowledgement of the specific statements that had been false, insufficient in the register of genuine remorse, but documented and distributed. He sent it by email to every guest from the rehearsal dinner whose contact information he had. None several of those guests forwarded their copies to me with messages that were various versions of good. 2 of my clients who had been present called to say the apology had been received and that they had no concerns about our professional relationship. Zora texted me the day after the apology went out. She sent a photograph of herself and Desmond somewhere sunny. Their honeymoon, I had no idea of the location. She had kept it deliberately mysterious. And the caption said simply, "It worked out." I sent back a photograph of my kitchen table with a cup of tea and the morning light coming through the window, which was the most ordinary thing I could think of, and I captioned it. "Always does." She sent back a heart. I sat in the kitchen and drank my tea and thought about what it meant to watch your child arrive somewhere good and what it cost to protect the arrival and what the protection actually required. It required documentation, it required precision, it required being willing to be difficult in service of something that mattered. It required sitting through a rehearsal dinner with your hands flat in your lap and not saying anything while you formulated the plan. It required trusting that the truth, documented and delivered in full, was more durable than the damage of a single evening's cruelty. He said no one would believe me. He hadn't said it exactly, but it was the premise of what he had done, that in the absence of documentation, the accusation would stand. He was wrong about that. The documentation existed. It always had. I had just never had to use it against my own daughter's rehearsal dinner before,